this little infographic here sort of shows you what psychologists refer to as the self-conscious emotions, and they're also referred to separately as the moral emotions. They're very much about, let's see, self-conscious. It's spelled incorrectly. I feel a bit shameful about my spelling errors today. I have to fix that one up. So shame is there in blue because that's kind of the big one. And when we think about primary emotions, there's really just a few primary emotions, and shame is one of them. Pride is actually the other primary emotion, but it's the antithesis to shame. And then we've got feelings like sadness and joy, and they kind of make up the sort of the core of primary emotions. And all the other emotions that we tend to talk about, it's like a rainbow. We've got our primary colors, and then we've got all the other colors in between. Emotions are very much like that. And if you do a quick Google search, you'll find a thing called an emotions wheel that has that kind of your primary emotions in the center. And then the next is like all the other words we have for emotions that fit into those primary emotions. Then you can go out again, and we get sort of more specific and detailed. And one sort of way of thinking about emotional intelligence is, to what extent can you use words at different layers of that emotions wheel. Guilt is an extension of shame. Yeah, this is what's critical here, and what I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail is how shame and guilt fit together. So shame is the primary emotion. That's the beginning point. And yet shame can be transformed into guilt, and very often is transformed into guilt. And what's really interesting and surprising about that understanding or that insight is that that can actually be a good thing. And so there's a nice reframe that we'll do today around guilt, saying, you know what? You feel guilty, and it can really sort of plague you, and it can cause real problems in your life, but it's kind of a step up from shame. Shame is I'll go into that in more detail in a minute, but it can be very disempowering. So these definitions here, they cover both shame and guilt, because guilt is built upon shame. And Brené Brown defined shame and therefore guilt as a fear of disconnection. So, a good way of understanding it is kind of thinking that if people knew this, and we could put in a blank there, if people knew blank about me, then they would treat me differently. And the worst fear in terms of being treated differently is that they would reject me, they would abandon me, they would force me out of their group. And I spent a fair bit of time looking at sort of the evolutionary and biological predeterminants of our emotional states. And what's key here is our evolution as mammals. Birds and fish and reptiles don't really have this big concern about being booted out of the family, despite what you might see in Finding Nemo. But mammals are quite different. Mammals have thrived on an evolutionary scale because of this inbuilt determination to stick together and work together. Stick together for warmth, stick together for hunting, stick together for finding food, stick together for reproductive purposes, stick together for safety. And so we are the highly evolved mammal on the planet, and we still have these built-in mechanisms. And so shame is the fear of disconnection. And you see it in horses and dogs when the leader of the pack turns to one of the members of the pack and says, you know what? If you don't behave in accordance with the rules of the pack, or in a way that supports me as the leader or us as a pack as a general, if you make too much noise and attract other predators towards us, if you scare the game away, if you are antagonistic to other members of our group, then I'm going to force you out of the group. And that feeling of I'm going to be forced out of the group by the leader usually or by the group itself, is that feeling is that's the shame. So how do shame and guilt differ? Yeah. So shame is very self-focused. Yeah, it's very much, oh, it's about me. There's something wrong with me. I've done something wrong, and that sort of makes me a bad person. It's very self-focused. Interestingly, when they've done research on shame, they've found that this feeling of shame, because it's very inward-focused, it actually inhibits empathy. It stops us from being able to use our imaginations to understand how things might be for other people. It's very defensive. When I'm in a shame, when I'm experiencing shame, I tend to be very reactionary, and anything that sort of comes towards me that suggests my fear that I'm not good enough, or that I've done the wrong thing, or I'm bad in some way, I will react against quite harshly. And at the same time, I'm also having an internal attack on myself. I'm beating myself up. I'm telling myself I'm a bad person, that I always do this. I always get it wrong. I always mess it up, and nobody's ever going to love me. Guilt, on the other hand, tends to be very much other focused. It's this shift from feeling sort of shame about what I've done to sort of guilt about the impact that that's had on other people. And the research shows that guilt correlates very, very highly with empathy. And so if I'm feeling shame and empathy at the same time, that's what equals guilt. Yeah, I'm feeling sort of ashamed about my impact upon you, even if that you is not really a sort of a definite specific other. A good way of thinking about that is that, you know, if I'm able to talk about it with other people, then it's more likely to be guilt. If I'm sort of able to go, oh my God, I feel so guilty that then it shifts from being shame and into the guilt space. So shame, in terms of how we talk to ourselves, shame sort of has this internal message of I am bad, there's something wrong with me, I'm not okay, I don't belong. If they found this out about me, they'd eject me from the group. It's very much a shrinking in, it's very much about hiding, and it leads quite quickly, if shame is pervasive, if people don't know what to do about their shame, then it quite quickly leads to feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, and shame and depression are very, very highly correlated with one another. Guilt is more about that kind of, rather than that sort of, you know that phrase, it's not about the person, it's about the behavior, you know, make it about the behavior, not the person. And guilt very much does that. Guilt sort of says, well, I did a hurtful thing. I've done something that's going to have a negative impact upon other people. And so there does tend to be more of an opportunity to reach out, where this kind of guilt gets us in trouble is where it gets sort of tangled up with shame, and we feel ashamed of our guilt, and we're not able to reach out. So the sort of the messages around how to work with shame and how to work with guilt, both of them sort of are this kind of, I'm sorry, you know, it's this sort of, well, what am I feeling responsible for? What have I done? How have I, you know, what is it about what I've done that's led to these feelings? And both of them start with this kind of, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry about what I've done. I'm sorry about the impact that I've had on the world. I can see, or I've become aware that that there's a gap between who I'd like to be in the world, about how I'd like to see myself in the world, and how I've actually shown up in the world. And if I feel shameful, what's most important is actually that I forgive myself. To say, I forgive me. Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, I did that thing, and I think that thing is bad, and I don't want to do that thing again. But I forgive me for what I've done, and then I make a decision to do differently in the future. Guilt is different. It's other focused. So if I'm feeling guilty, then I want to say, look, I'm sorry to the other person. I'm sorry for what I've done. And then I want to ask for forgiveness. I'm sorry, can you please forgive me for what I've done? So it's very much about not showing up in the world in the way that I'd like to show up, being aware of that gap, but then saying to the other person, hey, I've done this. I acknowledge the impact that has on you, and I'm aware of the impact, or I think I'm aware of the impact that that's had on you because of my empathy. And so can you please forgive me? It's that asking the other person to forgive. Just having a look at the chat there to see what your comments are. So a good way of dealing with guilt, and you'll find this in the modules in the Uprise app, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But the first kind of thing to think about is what they call the responsibility pie. And often if something's gone wrong, this is kind of what we'll understand as sort of this circumstantial guilt. It's the guilt that seems to relate to a specific situation. Now, before I go on to talk about the pie, what can be tricky is if you tend to have a lot of guilt or shame anyway, that hasn't been dealt with, hasn't been processed, then what can happen is that it can be you can be filled with the feelings, but you can be unclear about where those feelings have come from or what specific relationships or events or interactions have led to those feelings. So a first step is to kind of go, okay, sit with my feelings and kind of become aware of where they belong, where they've come from. And you might find that actually, well, there was this and there was this and there was this. I remember when I was in my mid-20s, I sort of really had quite a full-on what I call a quarter life crisis, and I was filled with guilt and shame. There were a lot of things that I'd done in my teenage years and even as a child that I wasn't proud of, but I hadn't really had anyone to talk to about them. And so they kind of built up. So by the time I was in my mid-20s, if something happened in a relationship where I'd done something that was disappointing to me or I knew it had been sort of somehow impactful upon the other person, I was so full of all the sort of residual guilt and shame from all of my earlier life experiences that I found it really difficult to go, well, this is specifically about that. And that's where, for me, sort of journaling and personal work and therapy sort of help to sort of sort through all the past stuff and get resolution on that. And so nowadays, I can feel very, very clear that when something happens between me and another person, or if I've done something that I don't feel good about, then there's quite a quick kind of circumstance response. Oh, okay, this is in response to this specific situation, or this is in response to this specific relationship. And that's where this relationship pie can come in. So what usually happens is if we're feeling sort of overwhelmed with guilt, then we'll have this sense of, it's all my fault. So Mr. Regis Metrat, shame generates guilt. That would be the way to understand it. Shame first. Shame is the primary emotion, and then guilt. Guilt comes next. Shame is when we realize that the thing that we're disappointed in has had an impact upon someone else. So we feel the shame first, and then we feel the guilt about the impact of what we've done on the other person. That would be the most common way of understanding it. Of course, our knowledge about emotions is imperfect. I mean, the reality of emotions is that, and anything to do with human nature and human consciousness and human, not so much behavior, but the way that we as humans process experiences before they become our behaviors, it's kind of one of the sort of the missing links in science's capabilities. The other missing link is dark matter out in space. And so you kind of got consciousness and dark matter, and they're the two things that science goes, actually, no one knows. What is consciousness? No idea. What are your emotions? Well, we can sort of describe them and we can kind of find clunky ways of measuring them, but really we haven't got a great grip on it. So everything that I sort of put forward is based upon science and experience, but is not necessarily definite. It can't be definite like so much of what science is. But this is the way that we kind of are understanding guilt. Guilt is generated. Guilt comes out of shame. It's very much connected with, I feel ashamed, then I realize that I've done something that hurts someone else, and then that empathy connects with the guilt, and it's that combination of empathy and guilt that tends to, empathy and shame that tends to create guilt. So where I'm overwhelmed with guilt, the kind of guilt that I think people are talking about, yeah, it's definitely possible, Eileen, to feel guilt and shame at the same time. Did Kidda say something? I just want to see what Kidda's written there. It's probably better than the alternative of feeling guilty because you haven't gotten everything done. But knowing that others are always working super hard and overtime definitely makes the downtime guilt worse. Yeah, so it's that comparative. That's really great, Kidda, because you're bringing in the comparative aspects of guilt, and how when I feel shame, I might feel like I've fallen short of something. But when I sort of imagine, and you've got to realize that a lot of this stuff isn't about reality. It's about our imagination about reality. If I imagine everyone else is working really hard and I'm not working as hard as them, then the guilt can really explode within us. I can feel, really sort of responsible. And so most of the time something happened, a lot of the time, if you're overwhelmed with it, something's happened and something's gone wrong, a report didn't get, work-wise, a report didn't get done in time, a deadline didn't get met, something, a customer sort of was unhappy and sacked the organization, sacked your firm, and you feel really guilty about it. And you have this sense often of, oh my God, it's all my fault. It was because I didn't do this and I didn't do that. And if I hadn't have done this and I hadn't done that, then this never would have happened. And I can't believe of this. And so many people are suffering because of me. But we've got to challenge those feelings. And this is how we break down the responsibility pie. Who else had a role in this? Just asking ourselves, who else had a role in this? Yeah. Was the manager involved? Were there other staff involved? Was there admin involved? What about external factors? What other external factors contributed to this result? COVID is a huge one. Yeah, it's pouring rain outside, flooding. I'm just waiting for the internet to crash because there's a storm outside. How much if I sort of add up everyone else's roles and the external factors, and I sort of actually apportion, well, this is a percentage, this is like 10%, this is 5%, that was about 30%. What's my final sort of percentage responsibility? And then asking yourself, is there anything that you can do to sort of manage your portion of that responsibility? Is there anything that you can do about that? So that sort of starts to break this pie up into other uncontrollable factors, things that are other people's responsibility, and then realizing, okay, at the end of the day, this amount is my actual responsibility. What that does is, first of all, it moderates the feelings of guilt, so they're not all pervasive, they're not all consuming, we're not taking total responsibility, and it breaks it down into, just go back a bit, and it breaks it down into, okay, so I'm responsible for this bit. And then it's okay, if I'm responsible for this bit, what can I do about that? Who do I need to apologize to? What do I need to take responsibility for? What do I want to learn from this experience in order to be able to do better next time? And that's a huge one. That's one that's been so powerful for me, both in relation to shame and guilt. What do I want to learn from this experience about how I would deal with a similar situation in the future? A really big one for me was I was in. This is going to sound bizarre, but I was in the Black Saturday bushfires. House burnt down. My family nearly died. Lost our home. The whole community was destroyed. And there were a couple of things that I'd done wrong. I had a bad back, and I couldn't. There was some wood piled up on the side of the house, and I couldn't move that wood. Plus the fact that we were in the house anyway, and should we not have been there? Was I overconfident in the house's ability to withstand a bushfire? And I remember one day I was sort of thinking about this, and just wrote down on one side of the page, these are the things that I did wrong. These are the things that I feel really responsible for. And the reason I had to write them down is because my mind kept going back to them. I was in a state of of understandable post-traumatic stress, and my mind just kept going back to those things that I did wrong. And I literally wrote down on one page, these are all the things I did wrong. Turn the page. These are all the things that I would do differently next time. And I could not believe the impact. I did not think about those things again. I'd shifted my thinking from what I did wrong to what I would like to do better in the future. And the feelings of shame and guilt almost evaporated instantaneously. So the other one that people have been talking about is the pervasive guilt. Yeah, that kind of guilt that you feel almost all the time. Yeah, it's like, I always feel guilty. Now, my partner, I'm not one of these people anymore. I was more of a shame person anyway, but my partner's one of these people. Now, she attributes it to her religious upbringing, and I won't sort of name the religion, but people with religious upbringing can have this kind of sense of, God's watching, and no matter what, as far as God's concerned, I'm always doing it wrong. And yours might be sort of, you might have been brought up in sort of a religious culture or society or community or family. And so you might have this feeling of, no matter what I do, it's kind of never enough, either for my family or for my society, for my community or for my culture or for God. So I'm always feeling guilty. Often this means that you're feeling responsible for all sorts of things that are happening in the world, but most often it's feeling responsible for other people's emotions. Yeah. And most often, if another person's feeling angry, Yeah, mum's angry. Yeah, when you're growing up, mum was always angry, or dad was always angry, and feeling that it must be something that you've done that's made them angry. Or other people are sad. Yeah, mum's, and usually it's from growing up, mum's sad or dad's sad. And it's like, well, what have I done? I must have done something to make them sad, or or I there must be something that I should be doing that I'm not doing, and that's leaving them feeling sad. And so feeling that other people's emotions are your responsibility. And this most often plays out in close relationships, intimate relationships, or familial relationships. If a lot of parents, particularly mums, will be familiar with kind of that maternal guilt, that kind of never being able to do enough or be enough for your children. And the trouble with children, of course, is they're far from always happy. In fact, they're frequently unhappy. And so often seeing a person unhappy in you that you're responsible for, you think, oh, okay, well, that must be my fault. Men often get this with their wives or female partners. I guess men can get it with their male partners as well. And it's this this feeling of, I want to make my partner to be happy, but if my partner's not happy, then somehow it must be my fault, because my role in life is to make my partner happy. So feeling guilty constantly that my partner's not happy. This comes with kind of a thought pattern of, I'm not something enough. I should be more, whatever it is. I'm not clever enough. I'm not wealthy enough. I'm not kind enough. I'm not able to predict the future enough. I'm not able to imagine, what this person's needs might be enough. I'm not working hard enough, and therefore I should. And it's that word should that really causes a lot of trouble. That fear of letting people down. Just seeing in the chat, people talking, saying sorry too much, worrying that saying sorry is a reflex. Well, I guess there's a lot of guilt there, and that we're asking the question of, how much of that is kind of pervasive guilt that needs to be worked through? Do you have sort of leftover guilt from earlier experiences that you could work through and resolve? Or is it sort of situational and you're taking on too much responsibility? And the trouble with taking too much responsibility is that you don't let other people take responsibility. So it's really good to take responsibility for what you're responsible for, but let other people take responsibility for what they need to be responsible for. P. Mitchell says, I relate big time being a mother, guilt with a teenage girl. And that's a classic example. Yeah, so often as parents, particularly with teenagers, we take on too much responsibility for their pain and their heartache and their tantrums and their teenageness, but also for trying to do things for them that we think are going to be good for them. And actually, the best thing we can do for them is to go, you know what? I'm responsible for being a good mum. I'm responsible for providing you with a safe home. I'm responsible for paying the school fees and the tuition. And guess what, girl? You're responsible for everything else. So whatever happens to you, it's not on me. It's on you. I'm here for you if you come to me, but it's not on me to make you into something that you are refusing to be. Stress is a stress word, absolutely. And absolutely, Courtney, I'm running out of time, but I'm going to get to that. It's so much around not enough. How would you deal with their anorexia? Too big a question. I'm sorry, Kerry, for this slide, but you're absolutely right. That really, anorexia has so much to do with guilt and shame. Okay, so solutions to the more pervasive guilt. Fortunately for me, and the time running out in this webinar, the Uprise app has in fact, what I'm about to take you through has a comprehensive intervention, a personalized intervention for you that talks you through this process. And it sort of starts with this, and we've touched on this in terms of culture and family. Where did I learn to think like this? Where did I learn to believe that I'm so responsible for what's happening to other people? Where did I
I can't actually hear your sound anymore. Oh, it's all good now.
The buttons disappeared, and then in trying to get the buttons back, I pressed the mute
I
button.
can hear you now. Thanks.
What do I really think? Yeah, what do I really think about this situation? What do I really think about my responsibility and other people's responsibility? Can I really be responsible for that thing that I'm trying to take responsibility for? Can I really be responsible for my daughter's happiness? Can I really be responsible for my child's eating habits? Is that really my Is that something that I have control over? And then fundamentally, am I enough? And if I can answer that question, am I enough, with yes, I am enough, then it makes it so much easier to not feel guilty, because the I am enough, and I think it was Naeli's, comments around work. I'm just not enough. It's whatever I do, it's not enough. I've got to be more. And if I procrastinate for half an hour, then I oh my gosh, I'm a terrible person, and I need to make up with it by working for an extra 3 hours. And I bet you other people have worked far more faster than me, so I need to do more hours so that I can be as good as them, just so I can be at an equal footing. But if we have a fundamental belief, and trust me, I only really worked on this in the last few years, and I can't tell you how much of a difference it makes in your life to actually go, you know what, I'm enough as I am. And you know what, I have to be enough as I am. You know why? Because it's all I've got. Yeah, what I was born with, what I've developed over the years, this is it. That's all I've got. And whatever I bring to whatever situation I'm in, it has to be enough, because that's all I've got. And so long as I'm bringing who I am and what I've got, then by definition, it's enough. Brene Brown says, imagine the infant child. Would you ever say to any infant child being born, newborn from its mother, would you ever go, oh my God, look at that baby. He's not enough. She's not enough. You never would. And yet that's us. And so the idea that I'm not enough, the idea that you're not enough, well, it's just not possible, because you are, and you always have been. And it's just a tragedy of human society and human experience that over time you've come to some beliefs that you're not enough in some areas. And the paradox is, of course, and the tragedy is that by believing that, you end up, recreating it. You create kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. And so just learning and finding a way to have that belief.